My name is Alexander Evans. I'm a professor in practice in the School of Public Policy here at the LSE. And relevant to this brilliant panel this evening, I was Deputy and Acting High Commissioner to India for the UK between 2015 and 18. So I have a background of working in and on India as a government official and many moons ago as a BBC commentator as well. But we're joined by a fabulous panel this evening. We've got Sir Vince Cable, who is a visiting professor in practice here at the LSE, but also a fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. He was UK Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills and President of the Board of Trade. That's one of those ministerial jobs where you do two for the price of one. Between 2010 and 2015, was leader of the Liberal Democrats from 2017 to 2019, and served for 20 years as MP for Twickenham, and retired from that in 2019. And that misses out a prehistory as chief economist, I remember, of what was it, of Shell? Chief economist of Shell, so brings a strong business pedigree as well. We have Kay Jin, who's an associate professor in the Department of Economics at LSE. Her research focuses on international macroeconomics and the Chinese economy. And her new book is out, which is called The New China Playbook, 2023. It's FT book that's been tipped for the year. So it's great. Available at all good bookshops, and if you insist, via Amazon right now. And we have Rathin Roy, who is director of the managing director of the Overseas Development Institute, Britain's leading development, non-partisan development institute, but also once upon a time of the London School of Economics and SOAS as well, right? So navigating around the different spaces in London. So let me just remind us that the event this evening is on the record. So it's an on-record event. It will be streamed and then available, I think, online. The context really is about the global economic centre of gravity, which has moved to Asia. And by mid-century, it seems pretty plausible to assume that China and India will be the world's dominant economies. And that's reframed, I think, so much global policy making, global economic shifts, and actually just thinking about where the future lies. We used to think that the future perhaps rested somewhere in California, between kind of Hollywood movies and Netflix. But if you're thinking about the new Netflix and chill for the 21st century, it's much more about thinking about Asia's rise, or as many people in Asia would say, Asia's return. Because for both China and India, there is a much more central role in the global economy and in global affairs hitherto. So without further ado, I will pass on to Vince Cable, but as usual afterwards there will be chances to ask questions or make disguised speeches pretending to be questions, but we will be less tolerant of those, okay? So I recommend questions rather than speeches, including, by the way, from those online. So Vince, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Alexander. You've set the stage very well. Basically, what I've been doing at the LSE and ODI is looking at China and India, partly backward-looking comparatively, how they got where they are, but partly forward-looking, what their emergence or re-emergence actually means. And I suppose the key point is that size matters. We're dealing with two countries, 1.4 billion people each. In terms of nominal GDP, people use this phrase, China is the second biggest economy in the world, but actually, if you look at it in purchasing power parity terms, in other words, you deal with the distortions that come from different price levels, China is by some way the largest economy in the world right now on that basis, and India number 3. And so the question is, you know, where do we come from here? And really what I was going to talk about was the shifting center of economic gravity, as Alexander's already mentioned. It matters because economic size isn't just important in itself and in terms of a market and attractors for investments and so on, but for soft power, for capacity to do research, for military reasons. You know, they flow from the size and the availability of resources. But what I want to focus on a bit is a changing consensus. Until very recently, I think it was sort of assumed that, China was sort of bombing ahead, 10% growth, then 7%, and this is all going to be sustained. And we're now getting a more skeptical view. Sometimes people talk about peak China, that it's reached the limit of economic expansion. And this is linked to what's sometimes called the demographic dividend, that the changing population structure means that India, with a rapid growth in the working age population, is potentially overtaking China within the next few decades. But that both countries, although we can be optimistic and say this is, this wonderful growth is going to continue, both of them are in different ways stuck in what we sometimes call a middle income trap. I've always thought the middle income trap is a bit devoid of content, but we can observe that there are quite substantial numbers of countries in Latin America, the Middle East, and elsewhere that get to a point where they find it difficult to break out from being a middle-income country to an advanced OECD country. There are a handful of countries that have done it. Korea, most obviously, Chile, and South America, but not much else. Now, what I've done here is I've just taken, this is what I would call a conventional wisdom view of the future. Clearly you could draw lines in any way. I've just picked up one conventional forecaster, Goldman Sachs. There are lots of others. And the view has been, I think, that, China will continue to expand at 5%, maybe something of that order, but then gradually the growth will slow down for sort of demographic reasons in particular. The United States will continue to grow at historic rates of, productivity growth plus a bit of immigration, 2%, something of that order. And then India, partly because of a demographic advantage, will continue to grow much more substantially. So 50 years from now, which is of course a long time ahead, you have three countries at roughly the same size, but for much of that period, China having a bigger economy than the United States, and much of the argument about geopolitics derives from the assumptions people are making about these different trajectories. What I've done here is I've just compiled a long list of different people who have made projections about growth in China, and you see that up at the top. A view that these are 2019 studies, people assuming growth of 9%, 7%, something of that kind. There was one skeptic, Larry Summers, expecting about a decade ago that actually China's economy had some fundamental problems. If it was going to continue to grow, it would be quite slowly. So as you become more recent, people are becoming much more cautious about China's growth potential. By comparison, I've got rather fewer sources for India, but almost all of them are assuming that future growth will be 6% plus. Now, these are just projections, right? They derive either from guesswork or in some cases from more sophisticated models, but that has been the kind of expectation of what the future looks like. What I've tried to do is to put together, in a very simple way, some of the factors that will determine the growth rates, high or low. The blue is positive factors, the red are negative. Now, I haven't put any numbers. If you're doing a forecasting model, you would be attaching values to these things. I'm just indicating direction. And, there are positive factors promoting investment, others inhibiting it, particularly in China, the large amounts of corporate debt and the construction overhang, at least in the short run. A key point is productivity growth, and that's something clearly very difficult to predict. Both countries are well behind what economists call the productivity frontier, so there's a lot of pretension for adapting best technology throughout the whole economy. There's potentially big digital dividend in both cases. But the one I want to focus on, because it is actually quite dramatic, is the potential variation in labour supply. And I've put up here one estimate of what the labor force in India and China might look like over time. Now, again, this is an estimate based on different assumptions about population growth and participation, but it does suggest that around 2030, China's labor force dramatically contracts. The Indian labor force, well, it starts to tail off in due course, but there is a big gap. And that big gap is what people call the demographic dividend. I just put this up to remind us that even population trends are very difficult to predict. This is the UN. It is assuming that as of now, the Chinese population declines, but of course there's a wide range of possibilities. And their assumption is that the Indian population will continue to rise, but again, you know, a lot of factors influencing fertility and population growth and life expectancy. So there is quite a bit of uncertainty, but two very distinct profiles. And this is what lies behind it. You see the yellow line, which is India's steady decline in fertility rates as the country's developed, women, better education, better health, life expectancy at birth, but a much more dramatic picture for China, which was largely a result of policy, and certainly in the later stages, the effects of the one-child policy, which I think Deng Xiaoping was the person who formally introduced it, but has, you know, dramatically pulled down the fertility rate to well below the rate of replacement of the population. So that's what lie behind these demographic trends. I don't want to dwell too much on the formality of this, but when people talk about having a demographic dividend, this is essentially what they're talking about. You have rising support ratio, more workers in relation to dependents. Of course, it varies depending on the extent to which people participate in the labour force, the extent of unemployment. It's not totally determined by population trends. But there's a second dividend, which is more difficult to quantify, that if you have a young population, which is saving in early middle age, there's a kind of life cycle issue here. But on the other hand, if you're running out of people, you can revert to machines. And what has happened in China, which is anticipating a lot of these population driven issues and rising real wages, is robots, which I think robots per head are now significantly higher in China than any other country in the world. And just, sorry, I don't want, these figures are not easily to follow, but just the little box at the top makes the point that China has a significantly higher percentage of the population who are now working age, but it's declining, whereas India's increased. But the key difference is in participation. You know, India's producing a lot of people of working age, but very, very low participation rates, particularly amongst women. I mean, this may be I'm sure the feminist economists here will point out that household chores are also productive, but the way we normally judge participation in the labour market, very few Indian women are actually part of the labour force. There's a vast disparity with China, and that partly explains. And then probably I'll just wrap up because I want to give you all a chance to contribute. This is a very simple description of what we mean by the middle income trap. Essentially what I'm saying here is we're not just talking about population. Population matters, but there's a whole set of factors which stand in the way of countries crossing the blue line. The blue line is the World Bank definition of high income. And you see China is just a bit short of it. Many parts of China, of course, well past it, but in average terms, it's still it hasn't quite got out of the middle income trap.
Is this PPP or exchange market?
GNI.
No, but at which exchange rates?
Sorry?
At which exchange rate?
I think this is at nominal rates. Yeah,
Okay.
I think this is at nominal rate. And just to conclude on that, these are the sort of big questions ultimately determining how one or both countries will evolve. And I start with this big demographic factor, which is a big issue in the case of China. But there are also other factors which are inhibiting China from breaking out of middle income status. A poor and declining efficiency of capital has been massive investments. China, very high investment rates, but increasingly low productivity of that investment. An imbalance of investment and consumption. It's very difficult to boost consumption levels in China. Part of the consequences of COVID, where people were frightened, not spending, and controlled by government restrictions, has added to a more deep-rooted problem of lack of spending. Of course, the spending will drive the growth through traditional multipliers. We've got this accumulating debt in the corporate sector and in local government, and indeed of central government, because central government is now buying out a lot of the debt, and that's accumulated to central government debt, which is beginning to look, not quite British levels, but a matter of concern. China has never had the confidence, or the government never, to lift exchange controls. There's a lot of pent-up flight capital. We know that there is a big gap in the education levels from the big cities, where you're getting massive PISA scores, and what's happening in the country areas where very low levels of attainment, particularly in secondary level. And then some of the political points at the end, the lack of a clear leadership succession, and therefore with implications for stability. And on the other side, India also has its fundamental barriers, and Rathin will talk about that in a few minutes. A lot of, as in China, unreformed state enterprises, particularly in the banking sector. A very serious problem of skill mismatch, that we have this enormous labor force, but very high and apparently rising levels of unemployment. A weak system of governance, and governance is probably a key factor in determining countries crossing over into the high income status, and a legal system which is theoretically wonderful, but actually doesn't work in most cases. Highly regulated labor and land markets, still a protectionist trade and investment policy, despite the move towards liberalization, and some pretty unstable sectarian politics. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a list of things, each of which are complex in themselves. But I just make the point that although we have these wonderful trend projection lines showing potential growth in China and India, if it's going to be sustained, these are the agendas which have got to be addressed, and they're both pretty serious. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. Thank you so much for setting the stage and to have this very comprehensive coverage about the two countries. I'm going to focus my remarks on China. I know very little about India, but it's a really interesting comparison going forward. Look, we're not hearing much positive news about China's latest situation, economics in particular. Of course, there are a range of other issues involved. We're hearing about hypotheses of peak China, Japanification, lost decade, and all of that. I do want to remind you that we have gotten China more wrong than we have ever gotten it right. I'm not actually sure when we have gotten it right, from at least outside of China. And it's something to still reflect on, because we're using a particular lens to look at and examine China, where they have a very different and unique model. Look, the short-term economic challenges are real. We have youth unemployment hovering around 25%, potentially even higher. The world average currently is around 14%, I think, so really quite extraordinary. The debt situation is real. It's mostly less so household debt, it's corporate debt, but really behind it, it's local government debt. And that has important consequences, because China's political economy is based on a model where the local governments spend a lot to support the local economy and nurture private entrepreneurs and so forth. And it's very, very, very powerful. I mean, if you think about the EV sector in particular, how did China become the largest consumer and producer of EVs within 10 years. Well, it was nothing short of coordinating entire supply chains all around China, rolling out 4 million EV charging stations in China. In the US today, there's 140,000, 160,000 EV charging stations. That makes a difference. And you have literally hundreds of EV companies in China competing with each other across provinces, backed by local governments. And the local governments really are creating mini Silicon Valleys around the country. And so that kind of political centralization and an extreme form of economic decentralization is really how you want to describe China rather than just a top-down system. That decentralization, creating dynamic entrepreneurialism, despite the economic macro challenges today, are still very real. But coming back to the challenges, the debt overhang on China, China's economic potential is very real because the local governments are very highly constrained, not least because half of their revenue derived from real estate until recently. And of course, we know that real estate is suffering from a contraction with negative investment growth. And you have GDP growth at its lowest in 40 years. But, you know, truth be told, China is much larger than it was before. So even at current growth rates, it still is very sizable. And in terms of contribution to global growth. But I think we want to ask the question of whether the couple of bad GDP quarters we have seen, and probably will see for another few, is really indicative of a cyclical nature or a permanent structural nature. And I'd argue that in China, there's been too few bust years in the last 40 years. There are no real natural cycles in the Chinese economy. It was always very stable. It was not about just pushing up growth rates on the macro level, but it was just about stabilization. So no booms and busts that are natural features of the market mechanisms. And if we can remind each other of, you know, US economies or UK economies, recessions are actually very normal. And one of the things that recessions are good for is that it creates that kind of creative destruction that makes a healthy economy. So you oust the bad and you release resources to the productive and give entrepreneurs potential entrants a chance. Now, in China in the last 40 years, nobody exited. You know, there was a very weak exit mechanism. Precisely because the tide was lifting all boats, the government came in, rescued all the real estate developers, and took care of the debt. There were a lot of zombie companies, SOEs, very unproductive companies that survived, not because they're productive, but because they had connections and they were able to just survive. So now we've recently seen that kind of dynamics coming into play, where a lot of the low productivity companies are exiting the markets, and I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. So that's the first point. Now, is this really a permanent problem in China, a structural problem? Yes, I agree that with the topic of today about demographics, but I'm really going to come back to that. And I want to just say, you know, let's go back to first principles in economics. When you decide about a country's growth, right, potential growth, first of all, you want to ask the question, where is it today relative to where it should be, that potential based on some fundamental factors, which includes things like savings rate and education and so forth. And I'd argue that sometimes we're talking about China as if it's already a mature economy. Think about the financial system in China. 80% of the current aggregate credit is intermediated by banks. Okay, that's a typical feature of a developing country system. Only 15% of aggregate credit comes from direct financing, so like capital markets. Now, it's the opposite in mature financial systems like the US. And so, but more importantly, let's look at where China is now. There's still 960 million people who are living under $300 per month. Okay, that's not middle income by international standards yet. There's 176 million migrant workers, which now having converged with the average urban worker equivalent income, spends a third of the consumption of the urban worker because they don't have social protection, urban rights. Now, imagine that you give them that social protection, that's going to unleash an additional trillion RMB hundreds of billions of additional dollars, at the very least, of consumption per year. We're talking about 1 billion people, okay, having that $1 billion people push to real middle income that I see as the biggest potential for a country like China, and we can't judge it as if it's already gotten there. Now, when we look at economies like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, they've obviously had great growth and they leveled off at some point. That's when we talk about peak Japan, peak Korea, etc., Hong Kong as well. Their total factor productivity, measure of productivity, was already 80 to 85% of US levels. Okay, China today is about 20%. Based on PPP measures, it's about 40%. So you still have a significant productivity gap. Okay, when we're talking about, historically, we see convergence among economies conditional upon a few fundamental factors, which include things like saving rate, technology, innovation, and so forth. And so we're not even there yet, right? The potential convergence, just the room for convergence is still very high. If we look at the tertiary sector, it accounts for services, it accounts for 50% of GDP. In advanced economies, 80%. It provides 47% of employment. In advanced economies, that's 80%. And so you still have that, again, think about the hundreds of millions of people scattered all around China. The biggest source of inequality in China is geographical divide. Okay, so if you look at China just based on the East Coast, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and so forth, you're an advanced economy. You're a rich country, South Korea levels. If you look at Gansu or middle and central, you're a really, really developing country. So averages do mask a great deal of things, and that heterogeneity is very, very important. So apart from that, the kind of potential of where it could be going, there are also fundamental big distortions in China. Now, there's a concept, a misconception, if you will, that the past 40 years, China grew based on investment. Now, the reality is, based on data and careful analysis of many, many different academics, almost close to 50% of the growth came from efficiency gains. Okay, so just reallocating hundreds of millions of workers from low productivity to high productivity areas of private sectors, and from rural to agriculture to manufacturing sectors. But today, the distortions are still very important. One thing that I do know that is different from India is that migration flows are really, really very small, okay, in comparison. So cross-province migration is very, very costly. So most of the migration happens within provinces. Now, interestingly, for a large economy like China, cross-provincial trade is much more important than trade with the outside world. So you can imagine that if you remove a lot of these internal barriers to trade, internal barriers to flow of people, the kind of efficiency gains that you can have and gain there as well. Right now, less than 5% of people actually migrate across provinces. So you're not going to be like in the US where you lose your job in Massachusetts and you find another one in Florida. So this huge misallocation of people and talent and labor is still very much real. Excuse me. Third, I think there is a skill education mismatch. And I do think there's also a little bit of a conception there. Think about the high youth unemployment rates, but the truth is there's 25 million to 30 million vacancies in the manufacturing sector. I want to talk about this because it relates to some of the demographic issues that we talked about. I'm born from the one-child policy generation. Yes, in terms of people not having children, the fertility rate sharply dropped. But also we want to ask, why are not people, having more children today? I do think that two really important factors, apart from just habit change, is the exorbitantly high education costs. Something like when I was looking at the data for 2010s, early 2010s in urban households, about a quarter of household expenditure was used to educate one child. And then I recently looked at the data, and something like up to a third of household income was devoted to educating one child because of the competition. And so people feel a lot of pressure. And the second reason is also the real estate. So hence we're seeing the education sector in China being, regulated, a crackdown, and the real estate sector also becoming the target. But the truth is that in China, education has raced ahead of the economy. In the last 10 years, there was an additional 100 million college graduates. Where are they going to go? What kind of jobs? China is still primarily a manufacturing-based economy, and it wants to push towards a smart manufacturing based on, technology, AI, 5G, etc. They don't have the skilled workers, the workers with the right kind of skills to be able to uptake that job. So there's a mismatch, and I think that's more pressing than some of the demographic issues that we have discussed. And just to be, just throw out the question a little bit about aging, do we really think, in my view, that 960 million people, okay, moving up the income bracket is way more important and significant currently for China than the potential long-term decline in population or labor force in China, for a few reasons. First of all, women right now retire at age 55, men at 60. They can easily extend the retirement age. Usually, if you look at economic analysis, demographics is a range of impact, but one of it is to reduce saving because elderly people save less. China's current problem is China saves too much. That's why there's not enough internal consumption. And right now, currently after the pandemic, household savings rate is at 50%. Okay, think about that compared to 5% or less than 5% in the US. That's a big change. And another is too little investment. Again, China doesn't have this too little investment problem. I think that we did mention about robotics, and I think China supplies or exports 50% of the world's robots. So I think two things that we have to think about is this: in this age of automation, AI, we're really talking about technology displacing workers rather than not having enough people to take on these jobs. And then the other consideration is immigration, right? I'm not saying that China is potentially open to immigration, but when push comes to shove, that is also one aspect of reducing the demographic pressure. So I guess the last thing I really want to mention is when we talk about the middle income trap, at least in terms of study, I'm not sure how well these studies are because, these are very general conclusions, very hard to test these things, but what prevents or what helps a country overcome the middle income trap? And one of the key issues, and I think it is the real key issue, is whether you have the ability to innovate and do and have a very good technology, technological capacity. Despite the fact that on the average level, Chinese productivity is still very low, I do think that it is very significant and probably way more significant than a couple quarters of GDP growth that you have the first time in history that a developing country can do cutting edge technology. Okay, one of the very important reports that came out earlier this year showed that, at least in terms of basic research, research being an important aspect of technology innovation, China's leading of 35 out of 44 sectors. Now, I might have given you this kind of picture of a slightly optimistic view. That's not the kind of thing I want you to come away with. I just want to give you a perspective on, where China could potentially go. This depends on a huge number of reforms, a lot of political will, and the model really still working. And that's a big assumption. Okay, it might not actually take place, but it would be wrong to conclude that peak China is based on the fact that China is too big or China can't grow anymore or China is going to be like Japan. One thing is, compared to Japan before the asset price collapse, China, even in terms of urbanization rate, is still 10 percentage points below Japan. So you have that hundreds of million people still wanting to move into cities and to own an apartment. So the kind of structural demand, I would argue, again, based on income a rise and ascendance, is more important than the potential demographic aging. So, let me stop here.
Thanks very much.
Go on.
Thank you, Keelan. I've learned a lot from you just now in these last 10, 12 minutes, and I look forward to reading your book. So let me actually try and dig out Vince's slides. We'll go through them. Now, let me start by saying that there are two elephants in this India-China room. One of them I will discuss in the Indian context. I think Kevin has discussed it as well. And you'll know what that is in a minute. And the other is, I'd like to get a little less Eurocentric here. I know we are in London still. India and China are the largest countries in the world in terms of proportion of the human race. And they're next to each other. So what happens to India and China also depends on how India and China deal with each other. They're not independent trajectories or trains moving, ships passing in the night, choose your analogy. I don't think LSE is the right place to discuss that, but if you're interested, I will in the discussion. So let me move on to pretending that India and China have nothing to do with each other and they have independent trajectories. All right, as a working assumption, I'm an economist. Right. Why should these countries not grow? Logically, if you're looking at 2070 or 2100 or something like that, it stands to reason that unless you have a colonial power, someone bombing somebody, someone infracting things in Asia, a war in Vietnam, problems in the sea, stuff that happens a lot in the world. The two largest population countries in the world should be the two most prosperous countries in the world. I'd avoid use of the word dominance, especially in view of the geopolitical situation nowadays. But certainly they would be the two largest economies in the world. Why would they not? If they did the right things. And to all intents and purposes, it appears that these countries, if not completely, at least in substantial measure, have been doing the right things over the last 50 years. So I think you put it very well. The question to ask is, are these countries performing on spec? And if not, then what inhibits them? I will now move exclusively to India for the rest of my talk. On spec. See, I used to serve in Brazil, Ambassador Patriota and I became friends there. And we had a joke in the BRICS in those days, a long time ago, which I know my Brazilian friend will forgive me for repeating because this was their joke. They used to say in the BRICS, back when we had a proper BRICS, in 2009, that Russia is a 20th century power, China is the power of the 21st century, India of the 22nd century, and Brazil will always be the country of the future. Now, and that was a Brazilian joke, and I really admired the Brazilians for sort of saying this because Indians and Chinese and Brazilians together, not being jokey people, it's a solemn affair, the BRICS. So, to what extent is this true that India will be the country of the future? Because Indians love talking in the future tense. As someone involved in Indian politics, I get tired of people using the words will happen. I am 55 or 56, 57. And I've heard this. India will be an export powerhouse. I've been hearing that since I was 7 years old. Our share of world exports is 1.5% of global trade. Okay, I have good luck to all the young people here. Maybe you will be an export powerhouse. But will be, I need to watch carefully because on spec is something Indians are excellent at, and we are very good at English, articulate people, we have Nobel Prize winners, so we're very good at convincing you that's a great place to borrow. What's happening today? Look at these graphs very carefully. Thank you for these excellent graphs. And please, let's stay at 2020. And let's move a little slowly. Don't do that. Sorry. India and the country of the future. What's happening in 2030? Actually, what you see, for those of you who are economists, look at the slope of the red line. All right? It's fairly even. India's slope, even at 2030, is still less than China, which means China's growth acceleration in the second derivative is still better than India 6 years from now. The slope only begins to approximate China somewhere around the point at which the Chinese economy becomes larger than the US economy. And the difference between India and China continues to be as large then, sometime in 2050, by which time I will hopefully be dead, as it is today. Or perhaps marginally smaller. I don't want to quibble. Indians love data. So yeah, maybe it's 3% smaller or something. It's not like 40% smaller, okay? That's a big gap, not so white in there. So what is this about dominant powers? All that comes when you start putting China's slope down there in 2070 and India's slope up. But it's very important what happens between now and 2040. Because on spec, if India does not do even fractionally as well as these optimistic Goldman Sachs graphs predict, then you're not going to be there at 2070. So India is in a very, how do I put it politely, in a very low per capita income place today, and will continue to be, according to these graphs, the low per capita income place till 2030. India is, you see, the poorest country in the G20 by a long shot. So on increasing size, I would say that the past is not a prediction of the future, agreed, but the present is still out. The jury is still out of the present. Chinese growth assumptions and Indian growth assumptions are interesting. Thank you, Vince. I've never seen such a comprehensive list of growth assumptions. I've learned a lot from this. And if you look at the mode, not the median, not the mean, the mode, because we are looking at different forecasts, then I'd say that Indian growth assumptions, Chinese growth assumptions here are somewhere between 5 and 5.5% long term. Okay, that's the first line. Forget the second line. That's fantasy. First line, 2030. Indian growth assumptions are between 6 and 6.5. In effect, therefore, with an economy much larger than India, with a per capita income multiples of India, what the world is hoping, all these forecasters from India, is for India to grow about 1% more than China on mode over the next 10 years. So this great transformation that will bring India, I'm not saying India will not grow and prosper. That's obviously it will at 6%. I'm not saying that India will not be in a better place than now. But if you're going to hyphenate India and China and talk about them as if they are going to be in some way in the same league in the Committee of Nations 10 years from now, these numbers do not give me that picture. It's not my view, just these numbers. Better say that nowadays. Future sources of growth. Now, this is very interesting, and all of this is true. What is it? Some of these have begun to change. The high savings rate has begun to tank. India's domestic household savings today, over the last 3 or 4 years, are in single digits now, 7 to 9%. And India's total household credit, finally, Indian households that can save are also borrowing. Credit card loans are going up, and therefore the savings rate is low enough for the government, when it runs its fiscal deficit, to actually for the first time want to attract in foreign money to buy sovereign Indian bonds, albeit in rupees, but still. The rest of it is very good. I completely agree. Fantastic picture on working age population, great resources there, huge scope to increase productivity, huge scope to increase services exports, huge scope to improve the single market in the future tense. So the potential is there. Nobody can deny it. How can one deny that? 1 billion people, very smart people, done all the right things, invested in infrastructure, have invested in IT, just put something on the moon recently. Of course, they're going to do well in the future. Everything points to that. But what could make that possibly go wrong in these critical 10 years? Very fixable, but what could possibly go wrong? Well, there is one thing in Vince's list which is absent. And that is also one thing I think that you mentioned in the Chinese case. And that's the second elephant in the room, which I'm only going to talk about India. But since you mentioned it, I think we should also talk later about China. And that is one very simple, large word, inequality. If you will, I would call India, and I have lived in Latin America, and I'm saying this advisedly, and I've worked in South Africa, and I'm saying this advisedly, highly unequal countries there. India is perhaps the museum. If you wanted to set up a global museum of multidimensional inequality, come to India. We have it all. Income inequality? I mean, what can I say? 80% of Indian households live on less than $5 a day per capita. 80%. All right? Consumption inequality? The government has to feed 800 million people. Feed them with subsidized food grains. It's a good thing they're feeding them. But, it's a G20 country, and feeding, I can understand universal school meals, but universal population feeding or near universal population feeding does not portend well for a country that says it's heading towards, it's putting people on the moon and that sort of thing. I mean, the two juxtaposed to each other simultaneously is surely a cause for money. We should be earning enough, given these growth rates, for people to at least feed themselves. They're not. So there's something wrong, and that's about inequality. It's really not about aggregate income. But it's not just income. Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state, bigger than 3 European countries, France, Germany plus, has a per capita income less than Nepal, next door to Uttar Pradesh. That's why I chose it. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Its human development indicators are comparable to Burkina Faso, Sudan, various crisis and fragile economies in Africa. Tamil Nadu in the south has eradicated extreme poverty. Its human development indicators are better than they are sort of medium to high, all right, which is coming into sort of lower high income stages. And its per capita income is comparable to Indonesia, which is the next poorest country in the G20. The two states coexist in the same country, and that's regional equality. I wish I had China's regional equality. This is the grandfather of China's regional equality. And yes, you do get intra-province migration, but what you don't get for the economists here is the T-boot effect. People from Uttar Pradesh migrate to Tamil Nadu, but they're called migrant labor in the same country because they go back. It is not like my grandfather who came to a great-grandfather who came to grandfather who came to Bombay from Bangladesh. And now I'm from Bombay. No one says you're from Bengal, thankfully. But that is not true anymore. So we're getting migration, but we're not getting permanent migration. So the kinds of what economists would expect, which is shifts of poor populations from poor states, low productivity states to high productivity areas, is not happening. We are borrowing those migrants. Tamil Nadu is a sort of third-rate Dubai for or the US for people from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Gender. I slightly disagree with you, I mean, maybe in the Indian context, on why the labor force participation rate is so low. Because in India, the labor force participation rate drops when incomes go up. Women withdraw from labor because it is not considered appropriate for a woman to work in a range of jobs. Now, unlike China, we haven't had a proper evolution. So we don't have women driving trucks, and we don't have women, except again in the south, in manufacturing in large numbers, like I see in Bangladesh. But many other kinds of informal sector jobs, and India is 90% informal sector, are places where there is limited female labor force participation. And you can see this particularly because in the exceptions, in the socially progressive states, Kerala, Himachal Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, the female labor force participation is higher. So it is a social problem. I could go on, but I think these are good enough. Income, I could talk about ethnic inequality, I could talk about many things. But you name an inequality, we can discuss it. So I think, and finally, of course, one very quick thing which is pertinent to this slide and the demographic dividend is inequality of capability, which is very, very high. The ability of someone who is even mildly poor, forget the fight, someone whose family earns 2 to 3 times the minimum wage, to break the ceiling and succeed in ways that you could in many other countries, including in China, even through a system of rationing and merit, is severely limited in India for a variety of complex reasons. In short, the education system is busted if you're poor. You can buy your way out of it to some extent, in limited measure. And of course, if you're rich enough, like many of you, to come to the LSE, you can buy your way out of it and come here. But if you can't come here, you can still buy your way out of it to a limited extent in India. But that is not enough to get the kind of demographic payback you would expect from the kind of population growth that we are seeing for India to achieve its full potential. And that's a third inequality constraint that we have. So in terms of these future sources of growth, I think inequality is the big overhang and will need to be dealt with. It's a very dark cloud on our demographic dividend, and it will need to be sorted out. There are then penultimately structural constraints. Again, Chinese productivity is low. Yes, my God. India is a fraction of China. And the fact that India's manufacturing share in GDP is lower than even Bangladesh at a per capita income, which is a fraction of China and lower than Bangladesh, means that in a sense, the kind of democratic improvement you see in workforce practices and in productivity, what Bhagwati called gray area dynamic effects that manufacturing brings, has passed India by entirely. Now, it didn't do this permanently because we have very successful manufacturing happening in the South and in the West, but it is too limited. And in the majority of the population, there is simply no manufacturing that brings its attendant democratic effects. You cannot be too sexist on a shop floor. You can be sexist in services. It's very difficult to be sexist on the shop floor. When you're building an aircraft, you're on the assembly line. You can, but to a much lesser extent. It is difficult to be discriminatory on the shop floor. It involves a much more collective spirit. And those are the things that we are missing out, I think, with the small manufacturing base. And I think those are the things that are going to lead us to this middle income trap. Most starkly put in the following fashion. Are going to lead us if we don't do something about it. Can something be done about it? Yes. Is something being done about it? I'm afraid not. And therefore, I think it is very urgent that we begin doing something about this. And the first step there is to recognize the problem and to speak a little less in the future tense. We have a problem. The leading indicators of the Indian economy, if you ask any economist in Bombay, are the following. Air travel. How many people in India take planes? A lot more than they used to, but I would submit to many more people take trains. Automobiles. Why not bicycles? Most people in India use bicycles, two-wheelers. Fast-moving consumer goods. 90% of the Indian economy is informal. There's a good reason why these are leading indicators of the Indian economy, and the reason is that these are the places that saw growth following liberalization in 1991. So last 25 or 26 years, what we have been seeing is growth in these sectors. And that growth has been supported by what? It's been supported by the consumption of the top 150 to 200 million of the Indian population. That's a lot of people. That's more than the UK. That's more than UK, Germany, and France combined almost. But it is only 10 to 15% of India, which means the stuff that people forget the poor. The poor are not good consumers. I'm sorry about them. They're not good consumers. If you just talk about people earning the minimum wage or twice the minimum wage or even 3 times the minimum wage, it's about 40% of India's population, 40 to 50 at least. What do they want to consume? Food. Agriculture is in a mess. Clothing, not t-shirts, 200 rupee shirts, okay, which are sort of sold in the informal sector. 82% of those clothes, not these Marks and Spencer shirts, these are made in India, but the 200 rupee shirts are imported from Bangladesh and Vietnam. Housing. I can buy a house. I can go and get a mortgage and buy a house. If I'm going to build a house for someone earning the minimum wage, that requires a subsidy. Healthcare, only for the rich. Education collapsed. The 5 things that could form the engine of Indian growth by harnessing the effective demand of the bottom 40% of the population are not the engines of growth. And this, combined with inequality, if you study Brazil, if you study Indonesia, if you study, to conclude, the way I put it is, for me, transformation, I don't like the word development, I know. And ODI is just called ODI now for that reason. It's not the same thing. Transformation is a movie. I'm from Bombay, Bollywood. And this movie normally has a bad ending. It's not a happy ending. And countries try and make a happy ending, but it's very difficult, apart from the occasional South Korea, Taiwan, France. Just think about it. Philippines, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, Thailand. The middle income trap is sort of what I suppose Somerset Maugham like once said, the bitterness of an end achieved. But it's also the bitterness of an end that is not achieved. If you talk to countries in these middle income traps, they will tell you how difficult it is to get out of them. So to get this movie right, you need transformations. And the main transformation I think you need, I think this is, if I may speculate, also true of China. You need a social transformation. You need a social movement. It is not going to happen technocratically. And the danger of not doing it through having a social transformation and having society pay more attention to what engines of growth are not working and what the social and political impediments are, is the middle income trap. And the countries that I mentioned to you, if you look at their contemporary economic histories, you will find they're inextricable from their contemporary social and political histories. So I would say in conclusion, therefore, India is the country of the future, can be the country of the future, but it will have to do a lot in terms of both society and economy, and most importantly, about inequality, before it can reach, aspire even to reach a place where it can be said to be even gaining its rightful place logically in the Community of Nations, let alone dominance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And look, there's a perhaps to sort of open up. We'll open up a little bit of a conversation up here first, and then we're going to come out for questions both in the room and online. And I wanted to start with a very highly infectious disease, which is that of extrapolitis, right? Extrapolitis. It's the ability to kind of like do that half dependency forward and try to project into the future and almost invariably get it wrong. So I just wondered if what our panel might say, very briefly, if that's all right, had we had this conversation in 1980, is there anything that the consensus in 1980 would have got right about India and China? And perhaps if I could come to Kay, perhaps you first on this.
I think even in the 1990s, The Economist had a report saying what's the probability of China becoming 10,000 or whatever it is, and very low probability. So there was in 1980 there would have been no idea that China would be where it is today, even despite the current challenges.
Thank you, Vince. And would we have got anything right in 1980 about this? Do you think?
Well, I can't speak for 1980, but I can speak for the 1990s because I was asked as part of the scenario planning team at Shell to avoid extrapolitis and to think about plausible scenarios. And we looked at China and we did come up with a scenario which actually has happened, which is the 8 to 10% sustained growth. And very few people, business chairman of the managing directors and so on, thought this was remotely possible. China has far exceeded people's expectations of what was possible in terms of growth. And I think the question here really is whether, when people use this phrase about peak China, is this a continuation of the capacity always to underestimate what they're capable of doing, or have they genuinely reached a roadblock? And my instincts is that Kay was right, that the potential is actually very obvious, and that there are some policy solutions that are obvious. Whether their political system can do either of them is open to question.
Terrific. Well, and we'll come back very much to this question about what can be done, I think, in a minute. Rathin, 1980, do you think anybody would have got questions about India right? Because that was still the era of sort of talking down India and India's growth, wasn't it?
I wouldn't know. We were a command economy that didn't beat other people much. But certainly, I would point to the fact that you got the star of South Asia wrong. Everybody got it. South Asia's star is Bangladesh, not India. It has a higher per capita income than India. There's a high manufacturing base.
And then Vietnam.
It has, but I'm saying in South Asia. Yeah. So, and you would thought Bangladesh was a pretty shitty country, right? No concerts and that sort of thing. Look what happened. So you're right. These things are difficult.
So I'm not speaking against futures, because I think actually, part of what we teach in the School of Public Policy is trying to think about futures anchored policy making. But it's a huge global industry in government and in the private sector, and it's often wrong. And when you do have concepts like the BRICS, for Goldman Sachs, it was quite a strong marketing play when it was originally initiated. Can I just turn to one other question? We talked a lot about demography in the general sense. We talked about demography in a more particular sense as well, recognizing that difficulty again about projecting far into the future. We haven't talked a lot about longevity. Longevity, presumably, growing longevity in both India and China has quite significant impacts. And I just wondered in particular, does that in any way distort some of the assumptions we might be making about the future in an environment where presumably somebody's going to have to take care of a range of people who will have a longer life expectancy, but not necessarily a healthy life expectancy? Vince, any thoughts on this?
Well, there is this saying which is widely used that China's growing old before it's growing rich. This is used in China. And it is part of the inevitable consequence of having a higher dependency ratio. There will be more people needed to care for. The scale of dementia which is growing in China is just staggering, and the family structure as it's evolved doesn't appear to be able to cope with it. But there are offsetting factors, and Kay mentioned this, which is extending the retirement age. If you're run by the Communist Party, you don't have the same problem Monsieur Macron has in telling people they've got to work harder. But China has a politics, and it is openly being discussed at the moment, and it's very unpopular because people have got to put off their retirement, and their capacity to be supported by their kin is diminishing because of the demographic trend.
Okay, is that, do you think there is likely to be a change to the retirement age, and could that be a bit of a partial solution to that longevity trap, as it were?
In China, the party doesn't change, but policies change all the time. And probably the opposite in the US. So it can change anytime. Depending on the present circumstance, like you said, there are not these social constraints. There's not a huge aversion. Actually, people prefer to probably, work longer. And the longevity issue is, can they age, and still be more productive? Or is it just living longer but unproductively? And I think that the important question about demographics is really the fiscal pressure, right? I'm a lot less concerned about labor force, because we're talking about robots. Robots are taking care of elderly people as well. They're substituting with robots and products. I'm not worried about that. It's more the fiscal pressure. And also we have to look at just China in the short term. The intergenerational changes are massive. Each generation is so different from the previous generation. So before, you had to have lots of children because you wanted them to take care of you in old age, right? Now you don't need it, partly because one child is way more productive, earns much more, and you have the capacity to save on your own. So I think there are many dynamics at play, but the fiscal pressure is what I'm most concerned about.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that, though, which is just a question around, we saw this profound difference in many ways, but in female participation in the labour market between India and China. And just to what extent can that be sustained in China if there was a fundamental change to expectations about individuals having to take care of family members, for example?
So 2 brief points. One, thanks to the communist legacy, because revolution, women had very, very strong, equal status. Second, thanks to the one-child policy, the women had even greater status, because before they would educate their sons first, and now they educate the women. So again, the returns to educating girls are higher than educating boys. And again, I've looked at this data. Those born in the 1990s compared to born in the 70s and 60s, women in leadership roles in business, I'm not sure about, but government, except for the top, are extremely high, 40%, 45% women.
Which puts to shame some of the FT data this week on female appointments to boards in the UK. Rathin, and the longevity, is it a dividend or a challenge, I think, in the India context?
80% of our population households live on $5 a day. The life expectancy is not great. And the rich can afford to take care of themselves. We have 200 million long-term unemployed. There's plenty of people there who can profitably take care of old people. So money, of course, Indian politics is so gerontocratic that if we have longevity and the politician starts becoming eligible to be prime minister now at 70, the retirement age for politicians is 75, then that's going to create a serious problem in India. But I think the trouble is that, what China, very interesting what she's saying about China for me, because the traditional Asian way to deal with it, very sad thing to say, is how South Korea is dealing with it, which is very sad. Which is in South Korea, you join, let's say, Hyundai or something, right? And then if you don't climb up the ladder, you're sacked, and when you move to smaller and smaller companies, which less and less care, and you keep working in lower and lower jobs, and that becomes a kind of enforced decline in prosperity. I'm afraid that something very similar might happen in a country like India, which is not as, I think, caring about these issues as China is and South Korea is not. Here we're talking about a happy ending. It's not a happy ending for an old person in South Korea.
Can I just one sentence, because we're talking about China and India. I just want to, I looked at this really interesting. 1978, before China went on this economic transformation, by all measures of human capital development, India was way above China. Health, education, income per capita, etc. Way above. Or not way above, but above. And look what happened. That's what economic growth is.
Absolutely. And my parents were busy trying to work out how to learn Japanese. What happened to that? Well, look, let's open it up now in the room. And questions in the room, please do put up your hand. There will be a mic that will come. And, it would be wrong for me not to go to Andres Glasgow first. And Andres, the floor is yours.
Behind, aren't we? Supposed to. Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant panel. Vince, you convened it, so I hand it off to you. I have 2 footnotes and 1 question. Footnote number 1, the old joke about Brazil being the country of the future, is in fact not a Brazilian joke. That was said by Stefan Zweig, an Austrian, who briefly resided in Brazil and wanted to put down the Brazilians, and that was pretty good put down. It's second around the 1st century. My second footnote is you have great that black slide with all the estimates of growth, very, very informative. There was one that wasn't very credible, though. Justin Lin saying in 2019 that China would be growing 10% per year this current decade. that's kind of off the charts, right? The only explanation, I'm a cynical man, the only explanation that I think probably that he's an employee of the Chinese government, so maybe that's all you could say, but that's clearly not a very credible number. My question is to Keo. You were very persuasive in arguing that, we economists believe in convergence, and by every plausible measure of convergence, China's way off, right? And there's some particular bits that make that even more credible, the sort of, what once might have been called the reserve army of the unemployed, which in this case are not unemployed, but they happen to be in the hinterland, they could move, etc. It's a very, very, persuasive case. But then again, there are many countries that had the conversion potential and failed to converge. Brazil being a great example, maybe Indonesia and another one, there's so many. And when countries fail to converge, there are two things that blow up that keep them from converging. One is finance. They have a big financial crisis, like Malaysia and Indonesia had 15 years ago, and they could stop growing. 25 years ago. I'm getting my decades wrong. And there are plenty of people out there that are saying, look, there's so many bad assets in Chinese banks, there's so many overvalued things here and there, there's so many property companies with balance sheets that are incredible, at some point it will blow up. I'm a financial economist, so I love blow-ups. I'm hoping that one will happen somewhere. But somehow China never blows up. So my first question to you is, will it be finance? And if so, why not, given the stock of bad assets? And the second thing that causes countries not to converge is that the politics turns sour. This is the Argentina story. Wonderful country, beautiful, landscape, great natural resources, educated population. That's the thing we never aimed into the last 45, 50 years because the politics went sour. Could that be the factor that keeps China from conversion? At the end, you sort of hinted at it, but then you stopped. Tell us what you think about this.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Brazil, a number of other countries, I believe, is productivity that has held them back. And of course, you can say, what is the root cause of that? Look, why has there not been a financial crisis? It's very brief. I have an entire chapter on this in my book, but it's state coordination, state ability to coordinate all the banks, lenders and borrowers. Every financial crisis, I believe, crisis of confidence. The Chinese government will be behind that. And unless there's a perfect storm, okay, and by the way, it is more like emerging markets, but unlike the US, where there are many, many chains of linkages, it's more plain vanilla in China. So currently the commercial banks are just, increasing the balance sheet. And so unless there's a perfect storm where lots of big banks are in trouble and, there's no more fiscal capacity to deal with that, that's the case when there is a financial implosion. And by the way, the state banks and the bad assets were much more severe actually in the 1990s. And they were able to overcome that. So I don't think it's going to be a financial implosion. I think the question is more of a political question. The reforms, I deliberately talked about these big numbers because they're obvious things to do. Migration, service sector, high barriers to entry, right? And there's lots of things that they can do, but the political incentive has somewhat changed, right? The whole political economy model that I talked about, the mayors and reforms because they can break rules is kind of gone. And so now it's about political loyalty, economics is no longer a priority. At least I see that as the biggest risk in the short term. In the longer term, yes.
Let's come out.
Thank you so much for the session. I enjoyed all the talks. And my name is Shransh. I'm from India. I'm doing a master's in economic policy for international development. And I really resonated. And as a matter of fact, I'm from Lucknow. I'm from Uttar Pradesh. So it reminded, when you're talking about inequality, it reminded me of the line that whatever you hear and see about India is true, but the opposite is also true. So it reminded me of that. But yeah, I have like a lot of points, but just limited to one. So I come from a tier 2 city, and I wanted to ask about the major chunk of the population. Indian population is young. It's the average of India is 28. And a really important thing that I think we missed is the major chunk of Indian population is rural. And there's sort of saturation in the urban metropolitan cities of India. And you come from Bombay, you must be knowing that how there's a living crisis in Bombay, the property rates and everything, the living costs in Bombay. I did my undergrad in Bangalore. Bangalore is pretty much the same. They are expanding the city on marshlands, and it's leading to floods during rain because there's just not enough infrastructure to handle such huge population in the metropolitan part of India. So I just wanted to know, provided that the major chunk of population is young and it's rural, and there's such saturation in the metropolitan urban area, what's the potential that tier 2 cities like that Lucknow that I come from holds in such a this thing, and what it leads to? Yeah.
Russell.
We don't have a choice, really, because you're right. The metropolitan cities are saturated. They needn't be, but they are. But the point is not that. The point, again, is if you go back to what I was saying, none of the things that would drive the Indian economy into an inclusive growth path are produced in the metropolitan cities. Bombay produces movies and finance. All right? Delhi produces maybe a few Marathis, the national capital region, and government. I don't know what Calcutta produces. Bangalore produces IT. These are not the drivers of the Indian economy as they ought to be if you want inclusive growth. What you would then want is 60 to 70% of our growth coming from agriculture, import substitution of low-end textiles, health, education, and housing. All these, there is huge demand for in tier 2, tier 3 cities, and even in peri-urban areas. The trouble is because we have now focused on these sort of fast-moving indicators of the Indian economy, which have focused our growth both in metropolitan cities, we are not taking advantage of our greatest strength, which is the fact that our growth can be dispersed, diverse, and therefore inclusive and high.
Thank you. That's right. Let's come over to the gentleman just there, straight up in the middle. Yeah.
I'm an economist from Ministry of Justice, UK government, and also a part-time student here at SPP. I just want to ask the questions regarding the trade opportunities between the two nations and whether that causes challenge or opportunities to the West. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So trade options, presumably between India and China, right? So we're reconnecting, we're rehyphenating at nearly 10 to 8, which is always a good sign. Any views on this? Perhaps I'll go to Vince first. Vince, any views on your side on this, the actual bilateral trade and opportunities between China and India?
Well, it's very low, extremely low. I mean, it's virtually non-existent. And, and I guess that's because the comparative advantage structure is competitive rather than complementary. India could absorb a lot of, heavy engineering and really advanced technology stuff, but actually China's, things that China's producing are the things that India would also produce or want to produce. There isn't the complementarity. And also, India's a highly protectionist economy, highly protectionist still, despite all the liberalisation of the Manmohan Singh era.
So it's obviously the potential is always much greater. There has been a really big lift, hasn't there, Rathin, as well?
I actually think it is.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on, if you're looking at proportions of trade, India is not a player with anybody. But China is India's biggest import partner by a long shot. We didn't make our gods. I mean, we had to ban firecracker imports for China for our annual Chinese festival because almost everything I buy in India is made in China. And we began to actually go to shops and say, can you give me something that's not made in China? China, on the other hand, doesn't import heavy goods in anywhere. So India is whether it is solar panels, I mean, the only reason we don't buy Chinese solar panels is it's a national security issue. And Japan with solar panels almost. They gave us a free loan, so we bought, I was part of that deal. $100 billion worth of solar panels in Japan. Otherwise, China is competitive in everything. And it's next door to us. I did a study, and this is a very serious issue about bilateral trade for India because the asymmetry is so stark. I did a study where I asked a heavy electrical manufacturer in India, this is 10 years ago. I said, what would you want the US dollar Indian exchange rate to be for China to become uncompetitive? The US dollar exchange rate then was 60 rupees to the dollar. He said, 130 rupees to the dollar. That was the difference in productivity between China and India. So this huge asymmetry is, I think, the biggest constraint to trade better. It's partly an Indian problem, we're not productive. It's also partly, I think, the fact that perhaps China is much more smart, if I may say so, about its protectionism than we are.
Do you want to come in on this or not?
So like China's pushing for regional trade. And I'm not sure that regional trade necessarily includes with India, but it is, I think a lot more globalization will turn into regionalization. But even the broader point, which I know is not the focus here, but it's really geopolitical, not only between the two countries, but also India as something in between US and China, and it will be used, or, India will use it also to its advantage, and that will also shape trading relations.
And we haven't even begun to talk about the conscious uncoupling or the friend-shoring, the onshoring, the challenges that have come from that. I want to take a few more questions. Can I perhaps suggest we take 3 this time round? And there's the lady back there who's been waiting, first of all. And I suggest we take 3 questions and then come back. Then the gentleman over there, and then the gentleman there, if that's all right. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Helena. So I used to study here for undergrad and masters. Now I'm doing something perfectly immoral, otherwise known as consultancy. Thank you very much for the panel. Amazing talk. So my question is specifically to Servan's Cable. As far as I understand it, please correct me, because long day at work, maybe a gin before, but sources of growth, investment, labor supply, productivity of growth. With labor supply predicated on population trends, birth rates, how do you explain the factors that influence that, specifically culture and religion? Because the traditional argument is the more traditional, usually right wing, the more tendency there is to be a high population growth trend upwards, as opposed to the West with, quote unquote, left liberal tendencies. So the fact that China specifically is going down, I guess in some, how do you factor in religion and culture into that explanation, and how important do you think it is?
Okay, so we'll come back to that in a minute. But we're going to dash across the other side of the room, and the gentleman there with his hand up, please. That's great.
I'm a professor of practice at economic policy at Nottingham University at NYU in China. Talking about disparities and the comparison between India and China, does the fact that we have provinces or states with higher income than others help us get a glimpse into the future, how those countries can get out of middle income trap? So if Goa, Kanakada, Tianjin, and Shenzhen have managed to go above this $12,000-13,000 would that give us an answer to, if they managed to, could the whole country be full? And then, if I made a follow-up, is would that work better in China, that is a state-run economy, rather than India, which is more market, and therefore the cross-sectional geographic distribution may not work as well as in China? Because I think what you were saying, is that the government intervenes in China and saves, and redistributes also, maybe something that does not quite happen in India. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And then this gentleman here.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I think what seems clear to me, and this gentleman has just touched on it, is that China is a command economy, and India isn't. China, they have a small group of people at the top who view the economy rather like a sort of large board game, and they can just move pieces around, and they have the power to do it, and they know they can. And if they're smart enough, which the Chinese obviously are, it just happens. And there isn't that much freedom in China to resist. India, on the other hand, is a lovely democracy, and Hindus are very cultured, charming people, and they like to talk a lot and argue. And, there's just things that just don't happen in India, which happen in China. And that's really fundamental. And the one thing I want to add is that the one genius thing about the Chinese Communist Party, as compared to, say, the Soviet Union Communist Party, is that they allowed private enterprise to flourish within that system. So they have allowed initiative, they have allowed profit. They have allowed people to make loads of money to a certain extent, as much as they can within the constraints of the political system. So they've got the best of both worlds.
So can I just ask, what question are you moving to here? As it were?
No, I'm saying, all right, sorry. All I'm saying is that that's a point which hasn't been emphasized enough in my view.
Okay, so just registering, as it were, that analytical point of difference.
Oh, well, you know, what do the panel think?
Yeah, what the panel think about. So let's come back to the panel then. We've got the question of religion, the question of can we all aspire to be a Tamil Nadu and a Shenzhen in terms of comparative provincial growth, and also this is a question about have we really gripped enough the differences in command and control structures between the sort of CCP in China and Indian democracy. Who would like to pick any of those?
Well, I'd just make 2 points. I mean, on the role of religion in economic growth, I remember how the great Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal made a complete fool of himself by writing a book saying that South and Southeast Asia were never going to grow because they didn't have the Protestant ethic, and they had a quiescent religion, which basically consisted of sitting around waiting for the coconuts to drop off the tree. But that's horribly wrong. As far as the command, I mean, we'll say more about this than I, but China isn't actually a command economy like the Soviet Union. So much of the growth is driven from below rather than above, from local government. The reason why we were talking about the debts of local governments and the financial crisis of local government is that is where much of the economic growth has been driven, rather than from the central planners at the top.
Very interesting question. Now, on one hand, I think it's very indicative that you have Eastern provinces having already reached the level South Korea kind of income levels. And that really shows, that China can do it actually, right? The other question is, China is large, right? One province is the size of France. So cross-provincial trade, like I said, is very important. Are you going to see specialization, right? Rather than everybody doing the same. And third, there is a curse of resources. So certain areas with lots of mining and commodities, they actually don't develop technology. The local government incentive is not to push. Shenzhen had nothing. It was a small place and had nothing, and they had to do it through productivity and technology, whereas the northern eastern China has commodities and mining and all of that, and they didn't push for it. So I think lots of interesting dynamics there. Finally, I do think that state coordination, state mobilization, state allocation is very important in certain instances. I wouldn't call it command economy, but certainly the big push, right, the big bang of China, the Chinese government has been absolutely critical. And I do see it as a distinction with India. And it's actually, in fact, that plus the enabling of the private entrepreneurs that has, at least in the initial stage, has really fostered this accelerated growth path. However, China hasn't reached the point where the state needs to retract. And more intervention is just going to be inefficient, and it's going to get in the way because China, the state has already helped to build the market or coordinate the market, which would have taken longer to build. Now it should be left to the private sector, and that's how China is going to be able to do that.
Well, religion in politics, I would say that I wish religion would, it's very difficult talking about this now in Gaza and that sort of thing. But I would say that ideally religion should help people to make individual choices and promote inclusion and avoid othering. I know of very few religiously driven societies where this is true. And therefore, perhaps it is best to leave it alone. Especially the othering bit. It's very easy to move from being spiritual and religious to othering people who are not like you. And that can go on for 50, 60 years, and presumptions can change as Gaza shows us. So without blaming anybody. The question of command and control, actually, I agree with what you said. I think what China was doing was using a deep state and a very well-entrenched state to take pragmatic decisions which allowed it to make choices that it would not have been able to make Sure, clearly, if it were more democratic than it was, possibly, though I have great respect for communist parties, I find it democratic inside. I don't know China as well as Vietnam. I would say the Vietnamese Communist Party is probably the best and most effective civil society organization I've seen in my life. It's a bit like the IMF. They argue about things inside the party and they poop when they go out. In India, of course, things happen outside. The point is not that. The point is the Indian state, while attempting to do everything, has always been relatively difficult. It's very good at doing two things. It's good at rationing resources between various groups, and it's sort of good at doing backstopping of social protection. The complex things that states do, like adaptive policy, it's been good at in fits and starts. That's partly because of the complex nature of the economy, which takes a lot of managing, but it's also because, to some extent, politics in India and statecraft tends to be trivialized by more immediate concerns in a way that China seems to avoid. That being the case, I think it is inevitable that the state will continue to play an important part in India. The question is which level of the state, and that an active industrial policy, I think, is an essential for India to be able to progress. And of course, it's already highlighted that there is a problem with inclusion. There have to be social movements which will no doubt impact the state, and different kind of politics, opposed to just technocratic statecraft, that will have to influence the way India develops in future. And I think the question of whether India will rise to its full potential entirely depends on whether that full potential, attempt to achieve full potential, is achieved inclusively. We cannot just have Tamil Nadu. We must have Uttar Pradesh growing also. And China has shown how you can do it to some extent. I think India needs to do that, but obviously the choices will be very different.
Well, thank you very much. Stating the obvious, we've run out of time. But I hope that for those of you who haven't been able to ask a question yet, you can come and collar our speakers and if they don't leave that room. Can I just ask you all to do two things? The first is to obviously make a diary reservation for the 17th of October 2043, when we hope to be back in the next version of this room to revisit all this and see who was right, who was wrong, and whether we escaped 1980 or not. But the second is to thank our speakers. So Rathin Roy, Kajin, Savins Cable, thank you all very much.